What we are going to talk about today are some things that are concerned with where we come from, and it's the Balkans. And just to kind of make some hedges around the Balkan, when I say Balkan, I really mean the geographical Balkans, the peninsula that stretches from Slovenia to Greece in Southeast Europe. And, but also I mean of imaginary Balkan as Maria Todorova would describe it. And that is a space that has some connotations that we can't avoid, whether we want to be politically correct or incorrect. There are certain things that are engraved in the term Balkan that that can't be escaped. So I would like us now maybe to just open the subject on the Balkans. The Balkans are perceived as the wild Balkans. It's perceived as the space of unlimited affect, and it's also perceived as a margin. At the same time, those who live in the Balkans perceive that space as very diverse, very different. We tend to think that we are different from those next to us or those far away. And some of us don't even think that we are on the Balkans. So I would ask all of you, what do you think of the Balkans, and how do you, when we talk about literature, how do you place the Balkans in your work? Does it feature as something conscious? Do you refer to it? Or is it a space that you don't really think about? Who will go first?
We should go by height. He's an expert on this. So.
Yeah. Well, as an expert
on the Balkans.
No, but you know, and many of you are familiar with all these, negative connotation of Balkans that had been fabricated 100 years ago. It wasn't always like that, especially around the Balkan Wars and so on. And this continues the whole idea of wild Balkans, of something, as you mentioned, a region of passions and region of wonderful things, but things could go horribly wrong. Now again, this year, as you probably know, is the centenary of the assassination of Franz Ferdinand, Archduke of Austria-Hungary. And again, we have all these Balkan stereotypes flourishing around about this, something that sparked the First World War and so on. All these people that are ready to do and commit acts that could endanger everybody and so on and so on. And also, as back then, I don't know if anybody really thinks that sort of 17-year-old Yugoslav nationalist / anarchist really started the First World War. And that actually it was a problem of imperialisms and so on. And so in this respect, you can't really think that Balkans are completely a laboratory on their own, yeah? And things that have happened there historically been very often influenced by outside. And then who is really barbaric. I mean, just look at the First World War and so on and so on, and you might maybe reflect upon this, or maybe take a view of history of other regions. For instance, Sweden. I like to talk about Sweden because we associate this with this wonderful, peaceful people and so on. Well, 200, 300 years ago, the biggest butchers of Europe were Swedish forces who would go around and burn and rape everybody. So that was, now we tend to see them kind of differently. Of course, the answer to these Balkanisms and the whole negative stereotypes, it's not, and I do it also often, to boast about it, to have positive stereotypes, to say, yeah, there is actually essentially
He studied in the United States.
But I think I like the concept, especially I think, and with this I'll finish. We use it very much in the former Yugoslavia, the word Balkan, and actually you gave a very inclusive and open and geographical definition of the Balkans, but people actually tend to use this word to replace Yugoslavia. Since the term is problematic to some people, it's not to me, but it's quite problematic to some people, and then we feel ourselves as the Balkan. And so I'll give you an illustration. When I was organizing these activist gatherings, we called it the Balkan Forum and so on, and of course we brought people from Greece and Albania and Romania and whatever, but it was quite funny to see these post-Yugoslav activists who would say, but why do we speak in English, why don't we just speak in Serbo-Croatian? Everybody speaks Serbo-Croatian. Well, okay, so you can see that you can have this type of...
You can have some imperialism inside, yeah.
Inside as well.
And what is it like to see the Balkans from the other part of the world? I would ask Vlada and Sasha. What do they? What does it look like from over the seas?
Well, I mean, what you do see is that there's an element of an image that is being constructed that doesn't necessarily correspond to your own experience of having lived there for a certain part of my life. So there is a sensitivity to that. Watching from this part of the world or somewhere nearby does have an effect of raising that consciousness. But one also has to be very careful not to, just sort of have a knee-jerk reaction to that and then just sort of, reject, every criticism of the Balkans, just because there are many details that do not necessarily correspond to, to what you feel is your experience. The question of Balkans in writing, which kind of hovers always there, is really the question of political in writing, and that again is one more place where Balkans, and I'm speaking only for myself, and it has already been said that Balkans is something that is basically ex-Yugoslavia or Yugoslavia, in through some transformations. So the question becomes how do you address that in writing, and that again is a place of ambivalence for me, because on the one hand, I do believe that writers from Yugoslavia, or anywhere for that matter, do have the right to write about things like love and art that are very general and also move us as do artists, as they do artists all over the place. But on the other hand, if I want to write a contemporary novel that is set, for example, somewhere in Yugoslavia or the city where I come from, then it is basically not avoidable, from my point of view, to somehow address the political question, because there is a social element in a novel. If somebody in my novel, a character, is rich, how did they become rich? That will have to do something with the war. If they left the country, why did they leave the country? So questions of locations, of social status that do enter description of a social context of what you're describing in a novel, well, then that becomes not avoidable. Whether you address it directly or you somehow work it in, that is a decision that has to be made, individually or in a given case.
Sasha?
Well, the Balkans is this funny term where you have to describe it, but you don't like this. I would explain it to people who might ask you for explanation directly, or, during the war and after the war, people are likely to ask me, or people like us in this position, what happened? Or, the ultimate question, what is the Balkans? Is this imaginary space? Why is it happening over there? What is happening over there, and so on? And so you find yourself as a person, as an American, as I live in America, but also as a writer, torn between the need to explain, because you want people to know, as our lives have been affected by it, because there's a crucial moral, political, historical issues at play there. But at the same time, you have to explain it day after day after day after day, and it's always bouncing off the same wall of, at very least, distance. And the concept of the Balkans, it's become a moniker for this wild space. Many of you, I'm sure you know, the book Balkan Ghosts, where Balkan, even beyond the borders of former Yugoslavia was represented at this insane space. It covers Romania and Albania and Bulgaria, just, wild people. So you want someone who you're talking to understand, no, we're not wild people, but at the same time you have to own up to historical facts of what happened there, and then you find yourself explaining it. And this is a difficult thing because there's a burden, implicit or explicit burden of duty for you as a writer, as a person, to represent what happened there.
To be a spokesperson.
Right. So there are no panels in this Penn Festival about New England, New England writing, because, well, nothing really happened there for many, many years. Northern Europe, because we carried this around. And so even if you try to avoid it, it is, in fact, as you're avoiding it, that's the moment when you pull the weight the most, because you have to reorganize your life beyond your responsibility. If you don't avoid it, then you're stuck in it all the time. This is an interesting problem in many ways, as Vlada suggested. It brings different responsibilities and tasks and challenges to the act of writing, because, and this is something that, particularly if we operate in English-speaking countries or write in English, this decision has to be made, and there are not that many precedents in the language. I like those challenges in that way. I think that's all I'm going to say right now.
But there is one thing which is kind of exceptional in our company, and that is that Ognjen decided to write a novel that has nothing to do with the Balkans unless we include Romania and the American in Romania into the Balkans. So I would like to at the same time, I will mention just one fragment from your biography, and that is that you didn't want to serve the army, and then you, at one point you said that the only thing that you did during that time is that you read books and you were reading constantly. So what were you reading if you didn't want to write about the Balkans in the middle of the war? I mean, now we heard that it's kind of difficult to escape. Was that an escape, a literary escape, or?
No, that's good and an important question, which I like to ask myself very often. Did Balkan create myself as a writer? The answer is definitely no, because literature that I read during those years that you mentioned are basically a lot of, in the first place, American and Latin American writers. So.
You want to mention somebody in particular?
No. No, it's our story about Gabriel Garcia Marquez. So, yeah. Okay. But when first of my books published in French, for example, I see that readers and editor insist to read my books as a product of that dark Balkan Empire. So it's very difficult to escape from that kind of prejudice and that kind of myth, which is very present in the Western perception of Balkan situation, and especially history. You mentioned Romania. I'm writing about the last European leper colony, which was really exist on that place, and Romania, in the same time, is the country of origin of one of the most important Balkan smith. That's a Grof Dracula, as you know. So that seed, it's very rough. It's still growing, and people and, let's say, readers from the West still like to taste that bittersweet
taste of blood.
Yeah, taste of blood. Exactly.
But I'll pick up on what Vlada said and now what you said. There is a political moment in literature, and not only about in writing literature, but in publishing literature as well. So there is something that sells. I mentioned earlier that Balkans are the margin, and the Balkans are the unconscious of Europe, and so there is a tendency that Balkans need to be seen in a certain way. However, at the same time, looking from the Balkans, and I will direct this question to address this question to you, Igor. Looking from the Balkans, it seems that at least some parts of them, of that space, and some parts of the society are extremely progressive, even in European, politically progressive, even in European context. So when it comes to literature, I think that literature is kind of perceived more of one of those things that can't really make a big difference, that can't really make political difference. But there is kind of a tendency to connect literature to politics in the Balkans. And I would ask you, what do you think about the direct political engagement of specific writers in the Balkans? Both, I mean, we have this kind of left-right engagement, so on both sides of the political spectrum. And also, what do you think about the engaged literature in, there is this engaged literature, very pamphleteering literature, on one hand, and then there is this, what I would call, oblique way of writing about reality, or at least this political reality. So can you give us kind of an outline of what it looks like, and especially because you are also yourself personally engaged in some of those things?
Mm-hmm. Well, it's a funny thing. I always ask myself. It happens with writers and film directors, especially. So someone say it's really good artistically and writes a great book, or makes a great movie. So why do we ask that person to explain us the world, to explain us how politics works, and to tell us, to influence the public, just because he published a book or poems or made a film? So this is, who is speaking, and what is, clearly these people acquire their social capital through their work. But this doesn't mean that I should trust someone just because someone is a great writer. And when you get into the political arena, these people, in my opinion, should not have so much space as they have, unless they do express, say, complex political thoughts, which usually they don't. And this is unbelievable to see, especially in the Balkans, that writers, Andrew Wachtel wrote a book called Remaining Relevant After Communism. It was about writers. It was a good social history of writers, and writers were quite important, yeah? Writers were fathers of the nation, then under Stalin, they were engineers of human soul. Writers were dissidents. Some of them are here at the Penn Festival as well, because this regime cared about literature, cared about their little poems, and actually carefully read them and put them in jail for that. Today, of course, nobody cares. Whatever you write, just write. It doesn't matter. You're politically irrelevant. So basically, when you get into the political arena, are you going to use your literary capital or something else? I think, for instance, that things I say, by being someone who is in political theory, political science, and so on, are when I'm in the public, I usually do not speak as a writer, yeah? Usually as a scholar. And this is another trap, because this is a sort of expert opinion, yeah? Which people like, and then they put University of Edinburgh next to me, and then that's supposed to have some kind of weight. The problem, of course, with the writers was that why we are so suspicious of writers, that they basically engineered the recent war. Yeah, the ideas that were circulating in literary circles in the 80s in Yugoslavia were ideas that were put in practice during the war, and that's something to really think about, carefully. On the other hand, I'm not going. It's easier for me to speak about this social role of writers or about their political engagement. It's much more difficult to speak about the relationship between this aesthetical work of prose or poetry and engagement. Yeah, and of course, we are all averse of the social realism, yeah, as engaged literature. That was the idea, that literature will also create a different man and so on. We know that the practical results of this social realism were not that great. And we know that usually it doesn't make a good novel if you just have an idea that you want to somehow to tell. But on the other hand, and I'm here referring to what Vlada said, you can't be apolitical, you know, and what you're writing does have a message and does have a worldview. And in this respect, I'm also, as I'm suspicious of writers who are so political, I'm also suspicious of writers who say that they are apolitical. They're just writers.
But let's refer to the margin, as I mentioned, to the margin of Europe and this kind of progressiveness. Vlada mentioned that writers in the Balkans have the right to address issues that are not necessarily imposed on based on the perception of what somebody else wants us to write or present. And but there's also one thing, and that is I would directly refer to what you are going to read today, and that is the political voice from the Balkans actually lecturing somebody else, and that somebody else is this big Europe. So I have a feeling that there is a moment in literature, especially in contemporary literature, that is kind of aware of its power and it's aware of its momentum, and it's in a way taking advantage of the global world, let's put it that way. So maybe this could be an introduction to the letter to Europe that you want to read now. And so listen carefully, it's a poem.
Yes.
Almost.
We have 7 minutes, I think, but I think this will be like 5 or something. I was asked back in 2011, there was a festival in Brussels about Europe, and then they asked all these writers from different places to write a letter to Europe. So it was to Europe. Where is it? You know, where's who said this? Was it Kissinger or whatever? Like, you know, whom do I call when I want to talk to the president? You know, this kind of ironic statement. But this was also a problem, to whom to address. What is Europe? And what I wrote, finally, it's, I think, tells you a bit about, you know, ambiguous relationship we have with this term Europe as such, and its historical weight, and its also uses and misuses of this term. So it's a parallel slalom, actually. This, you know, it looks like this, but I cannot read it in 2 columns. So basically, I'll go through the things that I like about Europe, and then through the things I don't like. So here it is. Dear E, every time I start thinking about you, a parallel slalom starts in my head. I both like and dislike the names of the competitors in this sporting event, the result of which is unpredictable because it seems there's no finish to it. We are destined to be with each other, to pursue this it's about Sisyph, no? Task of climbing and descending the same hillside, always in 2 tracks. This is a run that one can follow from left to right, from one road to the other, or the other way around, from right to left, and from what we don't like to what we do like about you. The marks that are left behind by these parallel streams of thought are shaped as both an ode and a lamentation, and can be read either way. Both streams are equally worthy. Only the content, as well as the flags down the run and the style of skiing, change with time. So take your place in the audience. Ready, set, go, Europe. I like to believe that from inside you we can make changes that will affect not just us, but the rest of the world. I like your capital cities when their names sound like those of Babylon and Alexandria once did. I like your revolutions and torn down Bastilles. I like to think that the European space is truly without borders, although we still haven't achieved that goal. I like your soccer. I like the way I miss you when I'm in America. I like the idea that you are an open continent, that your borders are not limited by seas or mountain ranges. I like to see the web that your rivers have created, like lines on the palm of a hand. From these, following the Rhine and the Danube, we can read your destiny. I like the fact that you have lost all your empires on other continents. You should have stayed at home. I like the fact that we think about you most intensely, that we sense you most strongly when living on your edges, the places that are already turned towards other continents like Constantinople, St. Petersburg, Edinburgh, Sicily, or Cordoba. I like the fact that your true representatives are those who cannot tell any of your corners their own because they are at home in your entirety. All those nomads, mongrels, hybrids, travelers, people with no country, polyglots, and Romanis. I like the fact that we can imagine you, never sure what you really are, what the meaning of your name might be, or even what you are supposed to be, and the fact that we recognize you oh so well the moment we leave you behind. I like the fact that you could embrace millions of people and that they could still feel at home. The fact that I know you, even though you will never truly know me. I guess it might be because of your lack of interest or your prejudice, insolence, and notion historically wrong that your center lies in the Northwest. I like to keep finding a part of you everywhere in the world, as well as finding the world within you, and not as some independent part of your landscape, but as an inseparable part of yourself without which you would today be worthless. I like the fact that your best literature is European. How could one write nationally anyway? I like the bare-knuckle boxing match I have with you, where the punches we throw at each other are fierce, just like the hugs. I like these things about you, even when they remind me of the things that I don't particularly like. And I don't like your arrogance and your indifference towards abject poverty, not just within your boundaries, but also beyond them. I don't like those fictitious north, south, west, east axes that turn geographical parameters into acts of fate. I don't like the creation of visible and invisible walls at your borders or within yourself. The fact that fragmentation is often the end result of your unification methods. I don't like it when you divide things into old and new, old Europe and new Europe. I don't like the myths about your origin, they are useless. The fact that you have looted half of the world and displayed the bounty in big city museums, I don't like. I don't like today these objects are testament to your shamelessness and the compromised nature of your name. I don't like the fact that you leave people to drown near your shores, the fact that the EU is your synonym, because I still believe that you are something more than that. I don't like your nationalisms, the one that boasts about Europeanism. I don't like the fact that you betrayed both the Spanish Republic and Sarajevo. I don't like it when you subject everything to market forces. It wasn't always like that. I don't like the shiny helmets of your conquistadors on the slopes of the Andes. I don't like it when you turn your back to the southern coast of the Mediterranean in spite of the fact that the Mediterranean is impossible to divide. The fact that you gave the world the concept of concentration camps. I don't like it when you try to define yourself and you try to determine who or what has the right to be European or not and what is meant by non-European. I don't like it when your governments arm themselves in order to defend their elite from people like us. I don't like it when my traveling companions goes to the EU queue and I go to the one mark others, and then he has to wait for me. I don't like it when you think of yourself as a center where all the while you are nothing but a narrow cape. The fact that the heart of darkness is always someone else, somewhere else. I don't like it when I only think negative thoughts about you. Then I have to go right back to the beginning and choose another track. I think about those things that, when I hear your name, I actually do like.
I think with the...
Can I ask a question? And not just, Vlada and Ognjen too. And for Bosnians at the beginning of the war, they were expecting Europe to intervene and then by extension the world because they thought they were Europe. And so no war or another genocide could be allowed in Europe. And then Europe intervened catastrophically. But ever since, there has been a tension for many of us and people there and people in Europe to decide whether the Balkans is Europe or not. And this comes to a head very much in relation to Turkey, and it's a part of Turkey that is in fact Europe. So in terms of literature, do you see yourself as writing European literature or the European literature on the margins or marginal European literature? or you're writing in a different position, from a different position?
Well, I would say that I write from a margin period. I mean, it would in particular then be a margin of European literature. So that would be the answer to that. But in the particular relation to European literature, well, yes, there is always that sense of belonging to Europe. But as somebody who was being formed as a writer, being formed as a reader, for that matter, I mean, certainly American literature and Latin American literature was a hugely important part. So I don't think I can particularly define myself within that sort of subset of languages that are the European languages. As a writer, I am on the margin.
When I was very young, yeah, when I was very young, my wish was to write American literature from my position. So then I keep to read and to write, and I saw it's almost impossible, and that was good result for me, because I'm really not clear what my literary identity is. I don't want to connect it with a nation, especially because I'm Montenegrin, and Montenegrin literature doesn't mean anything to me as you also. So I like that readers defined my writing whatever they want. Who want to call me European writer? I don't want to say those words now. So, but yeah, I grown up on absolutely different literature from that exists in country of my origins. So you will heard some of those results. So thank you.
But when we talk about literature, European literature or not, I think, and when we talk about the margin and to Europe or to the world, I think we have to talk about the language. And I think that Sasha has this experience of writing in a big language. And you three have this experience of writing in a small language. We call them small languages. I mean, we even organize a literary festival in Zagreb, which is called Review of Small Literatures, because we wanted to be ironic about small literatures. So I think it's really the question of language, whether you will be marginalized or not, because as we know, until you are translated from these languages into a world language, into a French, into English, into German, you haven't made it into the World Republic of Letters. So what Paris used to be until the 60s for the literary world, English language is now for contemporary literature. So I would like to hear you all four on your thoughts of the why didn't you, for example, Vlado, why didn't you choose to write in English, even though you have been living in Canada for 20 and more years? And Sasha, why did you choose to write in English? And was it an identity, literary identity issue, or was it a literary experiment? What was the relation to the language? Why did it happen? Who will go first?
Okay, so I don't really think I can answer that question in a satisfactory way, but it's simply because it was not really a decision that I made. It's something that it's a decision that was made gradually by the fact that I published my first book writing in Serbo-Croatian, and then a second book, and then a third book, and with each step I was somehow it looked more and more like I was making that decision. I could possibly at some point have made the radical decision, and I think it is a very difficult one for all of us to make. Well, now I will start writing in English. I didn't make that decision, so it got made for me. There are reasons that I like that decision and the way which was made for me. One of which is that I think that this bilingual sense, which you can never bracket away, is in fact good for me as a writer in the Serbo-Croatian language. So I have lived in the English language for a pretty long time, and it is always present. But writing in English and writing in Serbo-Croatian are not necessarily the same thing. The language has its logic. Each of the languages has its own logic, its rhythms. And sometimes I feel when I write in Serbo-Croatian that there is this other voice, a voice that is mine but not totally mine, voice in English that says, tone it down, keep it simple, don't do that. And that's interesting because you have a sort of built-in critic in a way that is sometimes useful, sometimes quite annoying. But it is nevertheless useful for a writer to be able to tap into that duality. And for that reason, I think I'm okay with the decision that I didn't make.
Well, I do write in two languages. That is, I do write fiction in English and have for now many years, but I also write in Bosnian. I had been writing in Bosnian before I came to the United States, or Serbo-Croatian back then. And then there was a break of 3 or 4 years when I didn't write in either of the languages until I enabled myself to write in English. And then I started writing in Bosnian again. So I write in two languages pretty regularly and have pretty much the same amount of words written in the past 15 years in those two languages. And I think that one of the languages at this point would not be enough. For some reason or another, I took a break from writing these columns that I write in Bosnian a couple of years, and I missed it. I was writing other things, but it wasn't enough because I need this bilinguality. I like to work in Bosnian language and in English, and there are certainly advantages to this, being able to hear two voices, as it were, at the same time. The reason why I started writing in English, again, as Vlada said, it was not exactly a big decision. It was, I believe in the audacity of despair. When all the choices are reduced and you have one or none left, then you choose one. And so and even however difficult it is or impossible at that point. And so it seemed to me in the 90s that I either write in English or I don't write at all, because my native language was not available to me psychologically, because there was war going on. I had no access to the language because people who were creating it, experiencing war under siege or in the war, whereas I was in Chicago, barely speaking the language, let alone thinking in it. And so I simply couldn't do anything in it. And I realized that I would live in the United States for a very long time, and therefore that the language of my active daily life would be English, and that I would have to write in English. So I just, started writing in English.
It's interesting how you mentioned the division, the functional division. So you write fiction in English now. I mean, you used to write it in Bosnian, but you also write nonfiction in Bosnian, and Igor actually does the opposite. You write fiction in Croatian, and you write nonfiction in English. How does it work for you?
Yeah, well, it's definitely English is reserved for academic prose and also for columns or comments or something like that. And now it's happening that I mostly when I write this, I write it directly in English and rarely, very rarely in my own language. Whereas fiction is this really almost sacred space of my maternal language, yeah? And this was never put under question. This is quite an interesting, well, I never tried to do it, but I somehow, whenever I enter into this discourse, which is literary, it could be only my own language. I had an interference of the third language, which was French, when I lived in France for 4 years, and I wrote my master thesis in French, and I wrote some articles in French. And at that time, I thought, well, I would probably, like Sasha, stay in France, so I should better learn it very well. But I never try again. I never try to write fiction. It is a schizophrenic position, but this is one of these productive schizophrenic situations where one thinks, talk to each other somehow. And when you can express certain things only in certain language, and not only that, I have to say that sometimes in my own language, sometimes I wake up and I have to name the thing, and it could happen that it could be some kind of word from the street language of Sarajevo, or it could be a Dalmatian word of my grandmother that would come first to my mind. And I want to be able, in the language I speak it, to use all these different voices and even different languages. But then you of course have to face editors, who always want to put you into the standard language. And you have to struggle with them quite fiercely in order to let it go, to open up the language, even if it's grammatically incorrect or whatever, to make it truly poetic. And also there is a problem if you have so many different voices in 2 or 3 languages that, who will be that ideal reader? Someone who can only follow you in all these languages, or who can grasp all these references. So you have to make some compromises with the reader there.
Yeah, of course.
In what language was literature Europe written? That was Serbo-Croatian, yeah. Correct. Yeah. But then translated.
I just think that there are more and more bilingual writers and bilingual readers, and bilinguality becomes a condition of living, and in Europe in particular. And in many ways, in the Balkans, it's by default now that all of us suddenly speak 3 or 4 extra languages. But still, even when it was one language, there were so many dialects that you would move between different tonalities. English, particularly American English, is so standardized. There's a standard, that is spread by television mainly, and then some press. But in Europe and the Balkans in particular, the dialects are so spread. There are so many different things that I can identify, and any of us can, a part of Bosnia that the speaker comes from, based on an accent and the use of words. That's one of the things that I like about Southeastern Europe, the Balkans included. And it's more complicated than that, because the Austro-Hungarian Empire was present there. My grandparents' native language was Ukrainian, and so on. But I grew up with multilinguality, with the concept, even if we're not practicing it in a way that I practice it now, that's practiced, in the Bronx, where people could be living a day in English and in Spanish simultaneously. But this is something that we all carry around in various ways. So in some ways, I have no evidence for this, but I dare suggest, just for contemplation, that if you come from the Balkans or even from Europe, you are more likely to end up being a bilingual writer wherever you end up. Even if you're writing in one language, there's a voice, that is present there, that you can think in 2 languages. And someone like Vali can shift in his life between languages, within the same conversation.
But one of you never doubted what language to write, even though he wanted to write American literature. So Ogden, I guess the question of language was never an issue for you. You always lived in
Serbo-Croatian.
you lived there. You didn't move around. You didn't live long enough in another linguistic environment. But your literature is extremely connected to American literature, or to the from time to times. And I would like you to read something today. It's a short story. And I think the audience would appreciate it, because it is dedicated. It's about Raymond Carver.
Yeah, the title is Raymond is no longer with us. Carver is dead. Of course, we are talking about great American short story author Raymond Carver. So this is not kind of a literary statement. It's a story about Raymond Carver. They were drinking juice, watching TV. The old set could only pick up 2 channels. She was expecting to give birth by the end of the week. He was an accountant at the at a sock and underwear factory. Perhaps I'll go round to Vladimir's, he said. His wife was leafing through the newspaper and did not raise her head. Perhaps, she said a minute later. It had been raining for 3 days without let up. He had read that very painful birds were 17% more common in humid weather. Medically unproved, but true. He believed in statistics and hoped that statistics would bypass them this time. The phone number's on the fridge. If anything happens, just call. Do you have to tonight? How do you mean have to? Do you have to go out? You know where I'm going. What's the problem? He said as he put on his coat. He had no idea where to go. The only thing for sure was that he usually ended up at Vladimir's. He lived alone and went to bed late. She supported her back with her hand as she walked. She went with him to the door so she could lock it afterwards. Her full belly looked healthy. At the hospital, they said hers was a textbook pregnancy. She believed the doctors and liked the bookish comparison. Bring me a book. Let Vladimir choose. I want to read something exciting, okay? Of course, he said, checking the umbrella. She kissed him on the cheek and locked the door twice. The stairs stank of urine. The rain would not stop that week, he thought, and looked up. The sky was the color of a dead TV screen. He would stroll along some neighboring streets and then take the boulevard to the Vladimir's. He would not have to avoid the puddles. He had good, watertight American boots. His socks would stay dry. The socks made by his firm bleed when they were wet. You had to keep it dry. When he went round the corner, he thought of a baby and tried to imagine how it would like. But he could only picture pale skin and helpless arms waving. An unborn child, a nameless being, he thought as she entered the drugstore. He would buy a bottle of whiskey for Vladimir and try to stay sober tonight. 20, please. He searched through his wallet. He only had 15. I'll put the whiskey back then, he said. You have to, she said, punching the buttons on the cash register. If the baby came on Tuesday, that would be on their wedding anniversary. Double luck, he thought, as she left the shop. But he still didn't feel real joy. That was probably normal the first time. He thought everything would change when he saw the baby, when he held it in his arms and called it by its name. He looked to the left and then to the right down the street. There were no crowds downtown that day. So much water, he thought, it had to run off somewhere. He skirted the larger puddles and chose the sidewalks under the eaves. The wind snapped 2 ribs of the umbrella, opening it became impractical. He would have coffee in the bar on the other side and wait for the weather to calm a bit. Your face, sir, the waiter said, pointing to his own face. What's wrong with my face? He said, perplexed. There's blood on your face. He touched his nose and looked in embarrassment at the blood on his fingers. Now it made sense, the metallic taste in his mouth in the last few minutes. It's my blood pressure, he said, and pulled out his handkerchief. It starts bleeding just like that, he said. Vladimir's apartment was on the 5th floor, just round the corner. Vladimir was a writer. He was 43 and wore his age like an old man. He was divorced and had a daughter. Little Ines lived in another town with her mother and came to visit once a month. He knocked, and behind the door he heard coming, and then an amiable Hey, bud, roll in. They shook hands and patted each other on the back. Vladimir took him by the arm and led him into the dining room. Sit down. I'll be with you right away, he said. He sat down and looked at the books scattered over the table. Piles of books. Instinctively, he wanted to turn on television, but his friend had voluntarily relinquished having a TV. I am much better known as the man without the TV, as I am a writer. Shocking, isn't it? He sometimes liked to say. Vladimir was in the kitchen. A sad night, old pal. He came back with 2 glasses and a bottle of whiskey. The greatest among us is no more. The great text teamer, the prince of short story, the baron of metonymy. Cut the baloney. Who are you talking about? You really don't know? He poured the whiskey and pronounced solemnly, Raymond is no longer with us, Carver is dead. Oh, so I don't forget. Your beautiful wife called, he added. What? Are you crazy? Why did you tell me right away? Give me the phone. She's pregnant, you know that. 621. He thought of the little yellow coat in the corner. 584. Come on, for God's sake. He stamped his foot impatiently. The phone rang 7 times. He thought he was going to be late for the birth. That she was in hospital already or perhaps in the apartment on the floor. But then her voice came a sleepy hello. Is it you, he yelled. Sure, it's me. What's up? You are okay and the baby, everything is okay? Everything okay, why? Say that again, please. Everything is okay, I said. What's wrong? He put his hand over the receiver. Vladimir stood leaning against the doorpost with his glass of whiskey and wide, inquisitive eyes. Everything is okay. False alarm, he said with relief and put the receiver to his ear again. She asked why he had got so worked up. She didn't understand. She had called to ask Vladimir about the book. He said he'd sent a good dead American writer. He died today, didn't he? He asked. Yes, he did. She said it was interesting to read when you know that the person, the writer far away in America, is still lying in an open coffin. And a wave of sadness, strange and strong, rolls in from across the ocean. You weren't there when I called, she said. No, I stopped for a coffee on the way. Did you get wet? A bit. I can feel the baby moving. It tickles. That's normal. It'll become soon. Please don't come back too late. I want the book. And you are not bad to have around the place either, she said. I'll be straight back, he said, and reached for his glass of whiskey. Carver was in his pocket. Before he left, he had one more glass with Vladimir and drank to his health. There was an American way of life, and there was also an American way of death, he thought. It was good that the summer had begun with such unpleasant weather. Warm, boring rain. She couldn't go outside. That damped the mood a bit. So far, they hadn't had any serious argument. He thought the two of them would have harmonious, easygoing marriage. A little more money would remove all misunderstandings. But it was good like this too. She unlocked the door, put her arms around his waist and hugged him. As she kissed him on the cheek, he felt her belly against the stomach. He wasn't sure he liked the feeling, and her face was moist, as mine also, as it from tears. Usually, she watched television before going to bed. She turned off the lights and lay down on the couch. The freshly whitewashed living room was bathed in flashes from a TV screen. Hues of red and green danced on the objects on her face. The bright reflections of the film explosions glistened in her eyes, the cool inexorability of the cathode tube. "Did you bring a book?" she asked. "Sorry, I forgot it," he said and went into the kitchen. "I felt it in your coat pocket." "Why the lie?" "Listen, I don't want you to read Carver tonight." She went into the hall and got the book. "It's cold and wet around the edges," she said. "I'm afraid it's like that inside as well, cold and wet," he said. She sat down and began turning the pages. "Please, leave it on a table." As if she didn't hear him, she began to read the first lines. "Leave the book, for God's sake. You don't need that agitation, neither you nor the baby," he said, getting loud this time. He thought Carver's stories would have a negative influence, but he wasn't sure how. "I'm going to the bedroom. I'll read there. Good night," she said, and quickly got up. He also got up. In the near dark, he worked on her fisted fingers with one hand. With the other, he gripped the book. She felt Carver going from her. "No," she screamed, just as her hands came loose. Today she would read. She would have this damn book. She caught one of the covers and dozen pages and leaned back. But he would not let go. He felt the book slipping out of his hands, and he pulled back very hard. In this manner, the issue was decided. Thank you. Sorry about torturing of your language in the last 10 minutes. So.
It'll survive.
You wanted to ask something, or?
No, I published the story when I was the editor of the Best European Fiction, and so I know it well. And I also like Carver, as many of us of my generation and younger did, and I recognize the reference to the Carver story. Little things. The issue is old, where parents pull apart the baby in the original story. But this is an interesting thing. I don't know if it's interesting to talk about, but I love these passing. We talk about Europe and the Balkans as they're completely discrete units, and then across the border from the Balkans is Europe, and across the ocean is the United States. But literature does not work that way. It's never so neatly divided. Even if you are a hardline nationalist and want your literature ethnically clean and want your borders clean, because apart from the few insane fascists, nobody just reads literature from their language. They read beyond that. And so what is inherent, literature, in other words, is inherently Balkanized. You have to go through many different landscapes and periods and countries and languages to accept the project as viable.
I like the thought that literature is inherently Balkanized. That's nicely put. We are running out of time, so we could discuss about the Balkans, the literature and everything for hours. But there is one question, and we have been kind of avoiding the elephant in the room, and that is the conflict of the Balkans. I mean, that's something that is extremely present in our lives and extremely present in whatever we do. And literature is one of the things that you do. However, as everybody else, I mean, we do things differently. So I think that I would like to ask Vlada about the conflict and about how you approach the conflict. You left the Balkans, or you left Serbia during the war. You came to Canada, or at the beginning of the 90s, you came to Canada. And you never actually explicitly wrote about the conflict, but you wrote about some issues that really that were really problematic in Serbia and still are. You wrote about the murder of or suicide of a journalist, and it's Yeah, it's suicide and in quotation marks. You tackled an issue from geographic distance, but you also tackled the issue from kind of a distance to the literary milieu that was at that time present in Serbia. So I would ask you how did you make those issues that were actually pressing issues for people living there? How did you make them your own, and why? You also write about people living in Canada, living in other communities, but you actually took the issue and placed it, located in Serbia at the time when you didn't live there.
Well, so my position is in a sense specific because, or makes it easier for me to answer a question of how to tackle this problem, simply because I left before the war, and I had this peculiar experience of leaving the country and hoping to come back after 4 years of studies in Canada, and that didn't work out. That's in a sense my departure predates the war, and in that sense, whatever I have to say about it is already mediated. I have not really, all literature in some sense is mediated, but at least in my case, I feel it is the least disingenuous position for me is to sort of mediate the story in some way. So how did I solve that problem in the particular case of publishing a book that I did some years after this event that you referred to was not particularly something that people wanted to go back to. My solution was that if I approach it directly, and I still believe that this was the literary honest thing to do, if I want to make this literature rather than a pamphlet, then I need to find a way of telling the story that in some sense makes it possible for the narrator to be amazed by some of the facts that are listed in the story, some of it based on documents, most of it, in fact. For me, or even more so for people who have lived through that period, the 90s in the Balkans, all of this stuff is somehow real and too real, and in some sense heard very frequently. And here in my book, it is a child born in Canada to divorced ex-Yugoslav parents, who is trying to figure out what is happening with his parents, what has happened, and what has happened with this story to which they referred throughout his childhood, and through which he is somehow finding out about this history. So this distancing of somebody who can look at this horror in a way that is still something that we, that on a basic human level allows him to kind of just be amazed and want to hear an explanation rather than just kind of go, oh, well, no, we've been through that. We don't want to talk about it anymore. That's too hard. So that's what drives the story, this curiosity of essentially a boy who is trying to figure something out. So that was my solution. It is very interesting that the reaction that I got to the book was basically the question, why would you do that now? Why would you want to? And I said, well, because you're not talking about it. So here's the story. Is that what
you were going to read from?
Not that one.
Sasha, can you refer to, you have in Lazarus Project, you also invented a way to talk about things, and you invented a journey to talk about those things. So I wonder whether you can relate to Vlado is talking about this mediation or
Well, I think that,
being a mediator,
I think
using one?
Vlada said it, I agree with him. All literature is mediated because unless it's absolutely autobiographical, but even it's an impossible proposition because even if you write autobiographical essays, they have to be edited and then you pick the story that you're going to tell out of the mess of your life. But it's also literature, it always has to spread beyond your experience, both at the times of your creating it, that is, you have to imagine people, even if the main character is somehow based on you, who are not you in the story. Or if you imagine the whole story from scratch, which is in some ways what we all do, no matter what, you occupy simultaneous, sometimes opposing positions. This is why literature is an inherently democratic process and why multilinguality is advantageous to the writers because you have to occupy different positions at the same time, as though looking for synonyms while trying to describe a concept, which is why literature in many ways is perfect for things that are hard to talk about. The downside to that from the point of view of explanation is it never really explains anything. It spreads the problems, it exacerbates the problems rather than explaining them to the end, which is why it's a difficult position to any writer to be called upon to explain anything to the Balkans, which is why I always resisted having to explain. At the same time, I want to talk about it, but in a way that does not explain it, but rather moves it into the realm of shareable human experience. And so I did not invent the thing in the lives of someone else had invented before, I'm sure. I don't know who it was. But this is what literature does. It teaches you how to talk about human experiences that are hard to explain because they're ongoing, continuous, are not resolved except at the moment of death, if you wish. And in other words, we all deal with different degrees of mediation, but mediation becomes an ethical issue if you're talking about the war, because it is not I was not in the war, much like Vlada, so who am I to talk about the suffering of people in the war? At the same time, why shouldn't I talk about suffering of people just dealing with war, even if it wasn't suffering? Because who else is going to talk? Otherwise, there's a strict segregation between people who are inside and people who are outside, and then you have a different kind of Balkanization. So mediation is at the same time the problem and its own solution.
I would ask Vlado to read, and then you will be able to ask questions. So Vlado,
jump in. Not that I feel neglected, but
I'm sorry.
No. It's because you. This is the important question, and I want to share the frustration I have with in my own writing. And of course, we cannot avoid it, even if you write whatever you want. It's a big elephant in the room, as you say. Even if you don't write about it, it's there. It influenced us. And I'm also, I'm also partly to blame. I did the same thing. I wrote about war in my book. It's about the siege of Sarajevo and so on. But it shouldn't be the only thing. Trauma shouldn't be the only thing we are constantly revolving around. And I have this huge frustration with my own writing, with the writing of other people, with films that we made, great films, fantastic films, whatever, but that are constantly going back to trauma. And there was one signal that I find particularly useful that is happening, and of course trauma is very specific for Bosnia. All these places, Serbia and Croatia, they have their own trauma, but for Bosnia, that's like there. And that's the film, 70-minute film done by Dani Stanovic, whom you heard about him. And he gave a very important signal. He made a movie which is a real portrait of a life of a Roma man who picks the iron. And this is how he survives. And he gave an important signal for different issues, which in this case, social issues, that you can do in a country, although horrible atrocities happened 20 years ago. But we can't constantly revolve around it. And the whole protest that happened in Bosnia, and some of you are familiar with that, moved away from that narrative, which is a narrative of suffering and trauma, and open up new issues, which is how we're going to survive today, what kind of society we really want. Move to the real social issues people have that are, of course, connected to the trauma. But trauma cannot and should not be the only thing, and shouldn't be also a motive for readers to read somebody's book just because we are going to find a lot of suffering there.
Yeah. Thank you for saying that, because as Ogden mentioned in the beginning, we are all kind of pushed in a drawer. I mean, we all do that. When you read Latin American literature, you do it. When somebody from the United States reads the Balkan literature or French literature, we all do it, but we shouldn't. I like the thought. But Vlada, can you just tell us what you're reading? You're reading from Farewell Gift. Yes. But it's a novel, so just can you give us
So actually, This is pertinent to the subject that we were talking about. So maybe I will read a very, very, very short excerpt, just like really short, because we're running out of time, and I don't want to take up too much time. But so I just want to say that this is one of the novels where this idea of mediation somehow appears, because it's a story about a brother who disappeared. And there is a sort of metaphorical sense to that particular aspect of the story. Most of the novel is sort of reconstruction of this idea of a brother that is no longer around. So I could read the bit that I planned, or I could just sort of go for just depends on the timing.
We have to keep some stereotypes live.
I will not go into all the details of the investigation that followed. It featured unpleasant calls from the military men and frequent visits of the officials from the Department of Defense, the career dunces, to whom it was impossible to explain the obvious, that if a person disappears, then the missing person usually has greater problems than being late for a week-long bivouac with a bunch of drunken reservists who, in a few years during a similar bivouacking, would kill or be killed or crippled or end up with chronic diarrhea or insomnia. I don't want to go into that. That is none of my business, not my reality, so to speak, because I myself soon left and avoided a difficult, embarrassing chapter of Serbian history, have enough reading in any case. I accepted a job at the Center for Human Simulation. That is the company for which I still work. It makes educational software for medical students. I had met their representative in Dubrovnik the summer before. An offer was made and accepted, a visa was arranged, a plane ticket was purchased. It was as simple as that. The only thing left to do was to visit the local branch of the Defense Department. I had to inform them, the officials, that I was leaving the country. These were the same men who, sipping apricot brandy in our apartment, tormented my parents with questions on their missing son's whereabouts, as though he were a person of utmost importance to the People's Army, the cornerstone of the entire system of national defense. I also had to tell my parents about that decision. One morning, a few months after my brother's departure, I took his shoes out of the closet. My mother had neatly stored them there as if he could return at any moment, saying he had just been at a chess tournament in a nearby town. Why did I take his shoes? If I'm not mistaken, I imagined I would feel more secure in them, more confident somehow, though they were half a size too large. With a sigh, as if talking to herself and not me, Mother said, "Look at the state of them. It's a disgrace." "Perfectly good pair of chukkas," I insisted. "Desert boots," Father said. "That's what they were called in my time." My parents were sitting in the kitchen having their first coffee of the day from small cups they had bought in Bratislava way back in 1976. For no apparent reason, only the small side light on the exhaust fan above the stove was on. They talked to each other softly and shrouded in a cloud of cigarette smoke. The pale blue haze swirled slowly around them and made them look like conspirators, the leaders of some resistance movement who met in the corner of a railway station cafe to bid farewell to each other. The flicker of the small light bulb, covered with an ancient crust formed by innumerable simmering goulashes and soups, resembled the glint of a gas lamp or a glitter of embers in the hearth. A horrible word, hearth. It should remind me of the warmth spreading from the heart of an archetypal home. Instead, makes me think of a hideous fart. I put the shoes on and took a sip of coffee from Mother's cup, accidentally spilling a drop or two on the tablecloth. I placed the cup back on the saucer and looked at the glass container with fossil lid in which we kept watermelon preserves. Seen from a particular angle, the preserves sparkled like amber. As a kid, I gorged on watermelon preserves and became sick, so that even today I feel nauseous at the very thought of amber watermelons or small glass containers with fossil lids. I heard myself saying, "I'm leaving for Canada soon." Mother was silent. Father reached for his cup and jerked it to his lip. I was certain he gulped down the dregs. When he spoke, his mouth seemed smaller, his lips stiffer than usual. "A wise decision," he said. Mother looked at him and said nothing. I took the necessary documents from my room, put them in my backpack, and went to the military office. I was ready to use any kind of argument, any kind of sophism, any kind of logical trick from the large repertoire I had learned from my brother, as if between me and the fertile gardens of the promised land stood a mythic monster disguised as a lower-level clerk of the Department of Defense in the municipality of Liman. I had told my brother about my dreams of leaving for the heart of the world, a ludicrous phrase which I'm afraid I actually used at the time. "You know what?" he told me. "The world has no heart. The world is not a body. And even if it were, you'd end up near its ass, because you're a dung beetle." He really could grasp the essence. The meeting with the bureaucratic monster at the military office proved something of a surprise. The man showed me a chair, and I sat down, timidly observing the ink-stained carpet while he was sorting a heap of papers on his desk. "Well," he asked, "what's your story?" "I'm returning my draft card," I told him. "I'm leaving the country." That is all I said. I expected him to yell how the city had become a cesspool of draft dodgers and sissy boys and degenerates such as myself. I expected the room to go quiver with the regulation-issued tirade about the external enemy and the enemy within and the enemy that never sleeps. I thought I would be subjected to a probing interrogation required to submit additional documents exposed to an outpouring of cliched patriotism. But the municipal pen pusher barely looked at me. He didn't even ask to see the documents I had carefully prepared. He did not ask anything at all. He stamped some form, mimeographed on a piece of dingy multiply recycled paper, signed it, and told me that I had a week to return the uniform to my reserve unit. I could have made the whole thing up. What lack of professionalism, I thought. It is difficult to find a plausible explanation for the sloppiness and indifference of these once meticulous officials. I can only take the advice of the venerable Sherlock Holmes and consider the one remaining possibility, no matter how improbable it may appear. My brother must really have been the cornerstone of the system of national defense. With his disappearance, this dreaded tower collapsed. Maybe he would agree, maybe not, I don't know. But to lose a brother is to pay too high a price for that.
Do we have time for questions?
Yeah, I hope we do.
2 questions.
Yeah.
Okay.
Thanks.
There are no questions. We'll sing a song from the Balkans.
I would just make one remark, which is, and it's a really stupid one, but actually, you all seem like American writers.
Thank you. It's the jeans, the denim.
Is that a compliment or?
I wouldn't. It's not. It's not meant as a wise-ass remark, and it's not meant as a compliment in any ordinary sense. It's probably a comment on what you were talking about, how the way in which the activity of writing is, especially now, become so completely
They might hear you better than
beyond
that.
this nation, beyond any one nation, so that can't help.
Thank you.
Thank you. There is a question there.
I have a question
I don't think I am, but being in the curriculum is not an accomplishment. It's how it is taught, and not just obviously me, but how literature is taught. And the way it is taught, in Bosnia at least, is wrong in so many ways. And I'm not in the curriculum, I suspect, because I cannot fit, and not because I think I can fit, but because of my background and life story into the divisions that these curricula are based on. They're ethnically organized, much like history and music and language and so on, and I do not fit into that. And one of the ways that nationalism is reproduced is by purifying it of all the problematic issues and people. And so, in some ways, it's a compliment that I'm not there. But I don't know about others. I would want the education system to change entirely, and then I would want to be part of that curriculum.
Actually, we're kind of out of time.
Can they just answer
Okay,
this
sure,
question?
Sure.
Yeah, well, it's interesting because you probably know in socialism it was extremely important. Literature was important, and writers wanted to be part of curriculum because you would get some kind of fee. You would very often go to high schools to read. They would pay for that, and it was the whole system how writers lived was different when writers were relevant, actually. But today, no, I'm definitely not. And the thing is that it's a double-edged sword, you know. When they put you, just remember, and probably you remember, and some people here, when we went through all these manuals, and when we were forced to read certain writers, and you started hating certain writers, you know, because you wouldn't ever want to read them again because they were there in that book, and you reach for writers who were outside of the canon. And this is when, as a kid, I was reading, you know, Charles Bukowski, because, you know, he would never, with his language, never get into the canon, but was important because it was alternative.